Hello and welcome to Nutrient Nirvana. How old is Avebury, Stonehenge, Giza? Are they all linked? And if so, how are they linked? Did the megalithic builders of the ancient world really understand the shape of the Earth and how our solar system functioned? And what were they trying to communicate to us when they were building these sites? These are some pretty big questions, so we're going to have to go to the very top today to get some answers. Mr. Ralph Ellis. How are you?
Yes. Oh, but I still see I'm His Majesty there, my preferred pronoun. Oh, well,
Is it?
never mind.
Yeah, I've given up with Loretta because people were starting to ask some serious questions about me. So I've dropped that
And
now,
I
and I've
don't
gone
think
back
that
to
most connection with uh,
possibly that may
with
have been
Life
a
of
bad
Brian.
time. Yeah. So anyway, how are you? All right?
Very well, thank you. Good to be back again.
Brilliant, thank you. So where shall we kick this off today? Whereabouts in the world should we go?
I think we'll probably start at Giza. Why not? Because I
Okay.
think Giza and Stonehenge and so on are sort of linked, so we can
Mhm.
start there and move on.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, you have the floor. Let's get going.
Yeah. So, well, just before I share my screen a little bit more, I was just going to sort of introduce this as being this is actually something I wrote in my very first book back in the 90s. And it's much more speculative than my theological stuff because, of course, there's less evidence. I mean, we're going right back into the megalithic era. This is in the pre-recorded history era, and so we've got nothing really to go on except for the megaliths themselves. And so somehow with these monuments, which luckily have been made sufficiently robust that they have lasted thousands of years, all we can do is interpret the designs that we see in these monuments. And the designs are much more complex than you might think, especially when we come onto something like Stonehenge and Avebury, which you might think is just, a rough outline of stones. It's more complex than that, and we'll see in a minute. But let's start with uh, Giza first, because I think we have information there that we can see that is useful. And if I share screen, so go into slideshow mode, and I've made my cursor nice and big here, so my cursor. Sort of, I suppose you could call it astrotheology. I think a lot of these monuments, the form and shape of the Earth and its motions and so on within their design. So they were encoding the knowledge of the era, and surprisingly, the amount they had was, rather. And if you build a monument in a certain stars, etc., has certain angles, encoding the date in which it was built.
Mm-hmm.
So the first movement of the heavens that we're going to look at is this one, axial precession. So is because
Yeah, I can see it. It's on the screen,
good,
so we're all good. Yeah.
yeah, because I have no way of seeing what you're seeing video there. So first of all, we have this um, which is going to show us precession, so that should move around, and that is precession. That's what they do. They precess on their axis, and of course, if we move across to the Earth is just a very big gyroscope, and so it has a much rate of precession. So that precession you saw on the gyroscope was like, I don't know what. The Earth does the same, but every 26,000 years. And so what we've
Yeah.
got here is the Earth pointing out to Polaris, which is currently the North Star, the pole star, and it will circle around that red dot just below it, which is called the North Ecliptic Pole. You might regard that as being the pole of the sun, basically. So the Earth doesn't point in the same direction as the sun does. And the Earth wobbles, it precesses, so it will do this. And it draws a nice big yellow circle in the heavens above. And we'll see this big yellow circle several times in this presentation. That is the precession of the equinox. So the axis precesses and it draws this big yellow circle in the heavens because the position of the pole star changes. And we have all this information because it's freely available. You can look it up. So we get this from Lascar. Lascar et al. He's a French professor, and he's calculated precession for the last 25 million years. So it's quite a nice, steady, regular sort of sine wave, something that you can use to calculate dates very, very nicely because it's so regular. And if you take his data from this website and plot it out, you get this. And here's a graph of precession. So what do we have here? On the bottom, we have, with my nice big cursor, that's easy to see, isn't it? We have dates from 0. Here's the 0 date going back 100,000 years. So quite a long time ago. And on the left, we have the position of the celestial pole, so the pole star, basically, circling around 0 back to 360 degrees, basically doing a circle. And this is what it plots. And so it's a nice, regular, I was going to say sine wave, but it's not. It's a sawtooth, of course, with a, let's draw it on, it's got a time period of 26,000 years, roughly. And it's fairly constant. It's not exact all the time. It changes, plus or minus a few hundred years. It does change, but not by very much. So that is precession. And we might be able to spot that in some of our monuments if we look hard enough. And the reason I know about this, just as a slight diversion, is because I know all about precession because I used it in my science paper, the modulation of ice ages by precession and dust albedo feedbacks. This was my, there we go, just highlighting it. This was my paleoclimate paper on why ice ages happen. And of course, it uses precession quite a lot in that particular paper. And it's an interesting paper because it says it was nothing to do with CO2, really. It was all caused by albedo, which is the reflectivity of the ice. So that's interesting. You can look that up. It's a free download, so you can.
Yeah, I'll link that underneath the video.
Yeah, it says not CO2. So yeah, it wasn't caused by CO2. So all of this alarmism about CO2 might be misplaced, you might say. Anyway, we move on because we're not talking about that. We move on to the Giza layout. So here's a layout. These are pyramids. And so what are these? Well, let's put some names on them. So here we have Giza pyramids at the top, standard layout, red pyramid, and the bent pyramid. And that's the layout if you look at it on the ground, from above. And the angle we're going to look at, really, the one we're interested in is this one here, which is about 191 degrees, which is interesting because from the straight line, it's an additional 11 degrees round to the bent pyramid. Number 11 is a pi number, and the Great Pyramid is the pi pyramid. It's sort of linked. But what I'm saying here is this is a very familiar layout. Anyone with a planisphere who's played around with a planisphere might be able to recognize this. And maybe someone has drawn it out on the ground in Egypt, as above, so below, because I think it looks like this. Oh, there's the 11 degrees. Never mind. I think it looks like this. So here's some stars and some points. And it sort of looks rather similar. And what have we got here? Well, let's put some names on this. This is Orion, of course, the belt stars of Orion, which look like Giza. And then down the bottom, we've got the ecliptic pole and the celestial pole. The celestial pole is the pole that the Earth points at, and the ecliptic pole is the pole of the sun, or the pole of the solar system itself. And obviously the Earth is inclined from that particular orientation in the sky, that particular pole. And it sort of looks the same. And what I proposed a long, long time ago, this is back in the 90s, I proposed that they were drawing this layout in the deserts of Giza and Dashur to look like Orion and the ecliptic pole and the celestial pole, sort of as above, so below. Why bother doing that? Well, because this angle, this marvelous angle, might give us a date. So what happens is, if you remember that processional picture of the Earth where it was wobbling on its axis and it was drawing a yellow circle in the heavens above, well, this is that yellow circle. So that yellow circle was the celestial pole orbiting around the ecliptic pole. That's what it was doing. And so we might have that same yellow circle drawn here in the pyramids at Dashur. And the angle we get between Orion and those poles can be made to be 191 degrees, exactly the same as we see at Giza and Dashur. And that will give us a date, because remember, as the celestial pole is moving around the ecliptic, it does so at a regular rate, and we can calculate that regular rate and get a date from it. And the date we get for this layout is 13,500 years ago. And that's fairly accurate, because each degree that we're measuring here is only 72 years. So, you know, half a degree is only plus or minus 30 years. I mean, it's a pretty accurate date, if that is what they are drawing here on the plateau of Giza and Dashur. So we get a date, and 13,000, that's even older than people say. You know, people have said that Leo is looking at, the Sphinx is looking at Leo coming over the horizon. We'll look at that in a minute. This is an even older date than that. This is 13,500 years ago, 11,500 BC. Quite a long time ago. And so what else can we do next? Well, we can probably look at the Sphinx looking at Leo. This is precession spotting. This is how you do precession spotting normally. You don't look at the North Pole star. You could do that for the dating, but that's not how people normally do it. They normally look at the constellation coming over the horizon at the dawn, at the spring equinox, and that will tell you what your constellation is, what the great month is. And so the constellations you can see here, Sphinx looking at Leo, these constellations will change every 2,000 years or so. 2,250 roughly years. But all the constellations are slightly different sizes, so it doesn't run according to that exactly. So this is what we normally have, you know, from Keepers of Genesis, was it? You know, these books from ages ago that were looking at the Giza layout. And this is what they were saying, that looking east, you were looking at about 10,000 years ago. Well, we end up with two dates here, because remember, Leo is quite a large constellation. And so it exits Leo at 10,000 years ago, but it enters Leo at 12,500 years ago. That's the favorite date that everyone quotes, 10,500 BC. But that's not quite the same as we've just calculated, because what we calculate, well, what I'm doing with this is I'm taking the median between those two dates, which is 11,250 years ago. But the previous date we calculated was much older than that, 13,500. So there is a disparity here. The Sphinx is not doing the same as the Giza layout was doing. However, there might be a modification to make here, so that, you know, all of the books we've studied on the Giza layout might be incorrect, because this is Giza from above. Nice satellite picture. You can see the 3 pyramids there. And what they're doing is they are looking at due east at the rising constellation at the spring equinox. And here is the Sphinx. And you can see how small it is in comparison with the pyramids. It's actually quite small. But the Sphinx is looking due east at the spring equinox. But is that what it's doing? Because this is the causeway it's sitting on. The Sphinx is sitting on the second pyramid causeway, which is angled at 14 degrees away from the due east point. It's not, the causeway is not due east. And this is a very special date. They call this a cross quarter. It's 1 month displaced from the spring equinox. So we're talking about February the 19th, I think it is, instead. So the sun will rise in this direction on February the 19th. So perhaps we shouldn't be using the spring equinox for the Sphinx looking due east, because it's sitting on this causeway, which is not looking at March the 21st, it's looking at February the 19th. So maybe we should do this precession spotting, this constellation spotting on February the 19th. And if we do that, we will get a different date. So here's the method and the date. So the cross quarter date for looking at Leo is 13,500 years ago, which is exactly the same as we got for the layout of Giza at 13,500 years ago. So there is a confirmation, a sort of equivalence between these two dating methods, because these are two entirely different dating methods. One is using the layout of Giza and Dashur, and this one is using the Sphinx, looking for the constellation of Leo coming up over the horizon, but at February the 19th, and it gives the same date. So what we're saying here is quite possibly the Giza site was laid out 13,500 years, 13,500 years ago. A long time ago indeed, much earlier, of course, than the Old Kingdom era. The Old Kingdom era is supposed to be 4,000 BC, 4,500 years ago, not BC, 4,500 years ago. So we're 9,000 years earlier than the Old Kingdom is supposed to have been. And so we might have megalithic monuments that are much, much older than we think. And can we confirm this? I think we possibly can, because we have other megaliths we can use. And here we're running back to Britannia, to Stonehenge and Avebury. And it's quite possible from the layout of these monuments, we might be able to see precession and obliquity in these monuments. And we've had this from, well, as early as Flinders Petrie, who wrote about this and did a calculation, a precessional dating for Stonehenge. And this was back in 1880 he did this. The only trouble was he got his precession round the wrong way. And so the date he ended up with was wrong. This was pointed out by Norman Lockyer, who pointed out the mistake, and he got a more usual date of 1,600 BC, I think he said. And then moving on, we had Richard Atkinson in the 1950s, who did a very good survey of Stonehenge, but he disregarded the precessional dating because he said, now we've got carbon-14 dating, so we don't have to bother with astronomical alignments and precessional datings. which I found a bit odd. You know, if you've got this new method, because it was new in this era, 1950s and 60s, wouldn't you want to check it against something else? But he didn't. He sort of disregarded precession as a dating method. And then we came into the sort of more modern era. Gerald Hawkins, 65. He's an astronomer. And this is what I like about the older scientific era, is they were prepared to step out and do something a little bit outside the normal. You won't find modern scientists doing this, doing a processional dating on Stonehenge. And yet he wrote a very good book, Stonehenge Decoded. Lots of good information there with all the alignments, solar alignments and lunar alignments and so on. Very well worth reading. And it was nice to see a proper astronomer do a good job on Stonehenge. That was followed by Fred Hoyle, who did exactly the same a bit later, 1977. Again, a very good book. Didn't do too much on the processional dating though, so we're missing out a little bit there. And then we have Alexander Thom, of course, who did a bit of procession, but mainly he was looking at the metrology of these sites, the actual measurement systems. So we've had a lot of investigations, but none of them have come up with these explanations. So this is all brand new. This is all from myself from the 1990s when I wrote about this. And this is all to do with, so we've looked at precession, that's the wobble of the Earth. Now we're looking at obliquity, which is the tilt angle of the Earth. And the tilt angle changes. And it changes actually quite significantly. So you can see the three axes of the Earth running through there. And we have the minimum in red, the current one in green, and the maximum in blue. So the tilt angle of the Earth changes by nearly 2.5 degrees. I mean, it's quite a big change, and that has a lot of effects on the Earth, on the climate. I mean, that's why it's involved in the ice ages, which I write about in my Ice Age paper, because it has a big effect on the amount of heat that gets into the northern latitudes. So, just in brief, precession will take energy during the summer. It'll take energy from the southern pole and give it to the northern pole, and vice versa during its winter period, as it were. And obliquity will take energy from the tropics and give it to the poles. So the greater the obliquity, the more energy is transferred, as it were, from the tropics to the poles. So it has quite a big effect on climate. And that's why we use these orbital motions in climate science. So anyway, that's obliquity. Where do we get the data from? Oh, no, before we do that, we're going to have a look at Avebury. So, yeah, these are the megalithic monuments we're going to look at, Avebury and Stonehenge. And anyone who doesn't know Avebury is a huge, great megalith and henge, 500 meters across, so, you know, half a kilometer. So big that it's got a village inside it. I mean, it really is huge.
It's the world's biggest stone circle, isn't it?
As far as I know, yes, it
I think
is.
so. And
And
with
it's
a
very
pub,
impressive.
and with a pub in the middle.
Well, since you mentioned that, here it is.
Brilliant.
This is the red line. See, you've got to get your priorities right when you're making a henge. You build the pub first, and then you build the henge.
I was going to say, what came first, the pub or the circle?
Yeah. Oh, it's definitely the pub. You know, that's why it's right in the centre of the henge. So, yeah. So if you're at Avebury, and Avebury is much better than Stonehenge. Stonehenge is a tourist trap, so don't really bother with that so much. Go to Avebury; it's much more atmospheric. You're not bothered by the what do they call them? The grockles, I think they call them, which is a real term apparently. I didn't make it up. A grockle is a tourist who doesn't know what they're doing, basically. And so it's a much nicer site to go and visit. But anyway, it was built a long time ago. And what does it represent? Because they put an awful lot of effort into this. So what were they trying to make? Well, it's a sort of circle with gates in the north and south and the east and the west, and sort of you can just make out sort of like an axis and like an equator across the center there. What on earth were they trying to recreate on the plains of Wiltshire? Well, I think, and this is very esoteric, you might say, because no historian would ever mention this, but I mean, it is a possibility. All I'm doing is looking at the shape and say, what does that shape actually look like? Well, I think it looks like this. So they were building a representation of the Earth floating in space, sitting on the plains of Wiltshire back in the megalithic era. And of course, if you look at this, we have an axis and an axis. We have an equator and an equator, and we have an Earth. And that's very interesting because it means that if that was the plan of the designer knew the form and shape of the Earth back in the megalithic era, including latitudes and longitudes, which are present in these little circles here. But I won't go into that because that's all too complicated for this little talk. And if you want to know what these represent, you'll have to have a look at my book, Thoth, Architect of the Universe, which details what these mean. And they're basically latitudes and longitudes. So yeah, we have the Earth floating in space. And the important thing, perhaps, is this angle here, because this is well within the limits of the Earth's obliquity. So the angle of Avebury, which I measured on a map of Avebury that was 1 meter across, so it was quite a big one. So I get a fairly good accurate reading because we've got fairly good data on Avebury. And the angle of this axis, which is like the axis of the Earth, was 22.5 degrees. And the Earth could well be 22.5 degrees. It's not now, of course, it's different. But within the limits of the Earth's obliquity, 22.5 degrees is quite reasonable. Remember, it went from, I'm just trying to remember, 22.1 to 24.4 or something. Anyway, 22.5 degrees is quite well within the limits of its range of possibilities. So, and that might give us a date. So where do we get this data from? Oh, we're back to Mr. Lascar. So Mr. Lascar does all of this. French scientist, of course, and he does all of the orbits of the, in fact, I think all of planets actually. But anyway, he did the Earth first. And again, he goes back 25 million years with this data. And you can download the data and you can plot a nice little graph. And here we go. We get a nice little sine wave. So what is this giving? Well, we've got the same dates at the bottom. We've got 0 date here. Looking into the future over here, of course. Anyway, this is the 0 date now. This is 100,000 years ago. And on the left, we've got the obliquity range going from 22.4-ish. No, 22.2. There we go, 22.2, all the way up to 24.5 degrees. That's how much the angle of obliquity changes. And it has this nice sine wave. And as we saw before, precession has a sine wave of 26,000 years. This is a much longer one. This one is about 40,000 years. So the angle of obliquity of the Earth, its tilt angle, changes over 40,000 years. Again, it's not constant. It changes plus or minus 1,000 years roughly, but it's easily calculatable and we know exactly where it was. And it forms this lovely sine wave. And we love sine waves because you can calculate dates from sine waves. So let's check that this is correct. Let's put today's date on it and today's angle of obliquity. which is modern obliquity is 23.4 degrees. And so we look along the purple line until it hits the blue line, and then we drop a perpendicular, and it gives today's date, 0. Because we don't tend to use BCAD for these calculations. They're all done in before present. BP, they call it.
Mm-hmm.
There we go, BP. Which actually is getting to be a bit of a nonsense, because they're ending up with the same problem that we get with BCAD, because BP is 1950. Well, we're no longer in 1950. We're now in 2020. So we're already 70 years adrift from BP. And of course, if you're doing things like carbon dating of materials, suddenly you've got 70 years to tack on to any of your dates. So it's becoming a bit of a problem. But anyway, we're not going to worry about that, because that's not what we're looking at. The thing we're looking at is Avebury. And as we saw, Avebury had a tilt angle of 22.5 degrees. So we can draw that on. Here's Avebury, 22.5 degrees. And you can drop a perpendicular. So what we're looking for is where it cuts across the blue line here, the light blue line. And so we can drop a perpendicular. And we're going to get a date. And I've put the date up the top so you can see it. It's 24,000 years ago. Now that's a problem, because that's even older.
Yeah.
So if that is what the designer was planning, they were putting not simply a representation of the Earth in their big earthwork, but getting the correct angle of obliquity too, which is not actually that difficult to calculate. If you watch the heavens and the movements of the heavens, you can calculate it fairly easily. So they could calculate it and include that in the design of their Avebury against due north, 22.5 degrees. They could be encoding the date by doing so. And that date for 22.5 degrees, angle of obliquity, is 24,000 years. You can see down here, 24,000. But of course, this is a sine wave, so this is not the only date. If you want to push the boat out a little bit, you can go to this one instead. So it could be 33,000 years ago. And if you want to take it back even further, if you're feeling very bold and you want a very old monument, well, you can push it way back to here, 66,000 years ago. Or back here, 74,000 years ago. Your choice. How old do you think Avebury could be? How old could those banks and dikes last? How old could the stones last? Well, the stones could last any amount of time, because they're made of sarsen. You're never going to degrade a sarsen stone. It's better than concrete, The only problem would be the bank and ditch. But if this monument was maintained, and so every decade or every 50 years they came along and dug out the ditch and remade the bank, because that ditch and bank has remained very much the same ever since Atkinson and so on was doing his surveys on it. It hasn't changed a great deal. And that was 50 years ago. So you'd only need to sort of renew the site once every 50 years, or perhaps once every century, and make the ditch and bank back to pristine condition again, and the site would maintain itself almost forever. So it could be older than we think. But it is pushing the boat out a little bit. I mean, we're going back an awful long time here, and it's not the same as the Giza date we found, of course. But we'll look at that, because that's interesting. But where else can we go to? Here's another megalith we could use. Stonehenge. Well, yes, we could get a processional date. An obliquity dating from Stonehenge, and we could do so by using precession, which sounds funny, but we'll look at that because that's exactly how we can do it. So let's have a look at Stonehenge from above. Here's a nice picture of Stonehenge. So you can see the standard layout. You've got the big ring and ditch. You've got the avenue running out here, the heel stone here, the big stone circles in the center. But we're not interested in the stone circle. That's just a glistening bauble to distract you from what you really want to see. What we're really interested in is the big ring and ditch and these small henges here. We've got one henge here, and it's not so visible anymore, but there is another henge here, little tiny ring.
Just so you know, Ralph, your cursor isn't visible.
Oh, is it not?
No, I don't
Oh,
think it
that's a
is.
bit of a shame.
Yeah.
I'm busy here pointing out everything for
Yeah,
you.
no, I can't see the cursor, sorry.
Oh, okay.
You
Well, I won't do that anymore then.
you refer
Okay.
yeah, you're referring to some, was it the, something just outside of the circle?
Well, I'll drop some red lines on it so you can see. So this is the big ring
Yeah.
circle, the earthen ditch. We're looking at that. And here are the two small circles, one there, one there. And what are they? Why are they there? Well, I think this is the only henge we have in Britain that has smaller henges stuck inside it. I think they have to be something special. And I think what we're looking at here is the precession of the Earth's axis again. This is just a quick reminder. We've seen this. And so the Earth wobbles on its axis and it draws a yellow circle in the heavens above. And here it goes again. Quick precession. Go on, do your stuff. There you go. And it draws that yellow circle in the heavens above. So let's look at Stonehenge from above in the infrared, because that highlights these two circles in the sort of north and south place. You can see them there. Why are they there? What is this picture telling us? Well, I think that the stones in the center are a representation of the Earth again, like we saw at Avebury. So let's draw the Earth in the center where the stones are. There it is. And the Earth precesses, as we've seen, and it draws those yellow circles in the heavens above and below, if you happen to be in Australia, of course. And so that's what I think these rings are at Stonehenge. They are the yellow circles. They are the precessional circles that the axis of the Earth draws in the heavens above. And well, we can probably animate that so you can see what it's actually doing. So here is the Earth wobbling its axis. Hopefully it'll do this. Are you going to? Ah, there you go. Look. And so here's the Earth wobbling on its axis, and its axis will be drawing these yellow circles in the heavens below. And that, I think, is what the Stonehenge designer was trying to draw in this layout. The Earth and the precession of the axis of the Earth. So again, this is saying that, well, if this is true, then the Stonehenge designer knew an awful lot more about the form and shape of the Earth and the movements of the Earth itself and also of the solar system. A lot more technical information than when we would ever give them credit for. And the interesting thing about this is that the size of these circles, these yellow circles above and below, depends on the obliquity of the Earth. Just as we've seen before, the tilt axis of the Earth varies between, well, 22 degrees and 24 degrees. These yellow circles will grow and shrink. So when the obliquity angle is high, they will grow. When the angle of obliquity is low, they will shrink. So if we can measure these yellow circles, these smaller henges, we can derive an angle of obliquity. So how are we going to do that? Oh, I think it's just going to get rid of all of those little pieces on this diagram. And hopefully it'll jump to the next slide. There it goes.
Yep.
So here's a layout from above of Stonehenge. We've got the stone circle in the center, and then we've got the earthen henge around the outside. And effectively what we've got is the celestial axis, that's the angle of the Earth, the tilt angle of the Earth. And the ecliptic axis, that's the difference between, that's the axis of the sun, or the axis of the solar system. And you can calculate, so those circles you can see in the north and south, they are the ecliptic circle again, the yellow circle in the heavens above and below. So there's our Earth in the center, and we have our precessional circles. And as I said, you can get a date, you can get the obliquity, and therefore a date, by the size of these yellow circles. So how big are they? Well, you can almost calculate, actually. You can almost count 1, 2, 3, 3.5 of these little dots around the outside. Now, these dots around the outside are holes stuck into Stonehenge which have no purpose. Nobody knows why they're there. It's been proposed that they were wooden post holes, but there's been no evidence of wooden posts in them. It's been proposed, and I think this is probably a better idea, that this is where the bluestones were. Remember, the bluestones at present are inside Stonehenge, the smaller standing stones. And it has been proposed that these holes were to hold the bluestones, and they were originally dotted around Stonehenge, around the outside. I think that's probably a better idea. But why have these holes around the outside near the ditch and bank? They're known as the Aubrey holes, and we have 56 of them. And I think they are a calculator, a very simple calculator. So there are 56 holes in a complete circle, which is 360 degrees. And so each hole is separated from its partner by 6.43 degrees. And that may seem like a very uninspiring angle to work with, 6.4, but there are 3.5 holes between the, as it were, the celestial axis and the ecliptic axis, the size of this yellow circle, this little henge. There are 3.5 holes, and 3.5 holes is 22.5 degrees. Exactly the same as Avebury. So the Stonehenge obliquity is 22.5 degrees. And oh, we also have the Pythagorean. Yes, I forgot about this. So on the left-hand side, top left, you see we've drawn in red a triangle between what they call the station stones. So 4 station stones that define the layout of Stonehenge. They were obviously used as marks from which the rest of the layout of Stonehenge was made. And they're made in a rectangle, and they are made to specific dimensions. And those dimensions in megalithic yards. The yard that was created by Alexander Thom, if you remember, he measured the megalith yard. And I'm just trying to remember how big it is, actually. It's about 82 centimeters. I haven't marked it down for some reason. Anyway, you can look it up, the size of the megalithic yard. And if you do so, you suddenly find that this red triangle is a Pythagorean triangle. It's a 5, 12, 13 Pythagorean triangle in megalithic yards, multiples of megalithic yard.
The megalithic yard is 2.72 feet.
Yeah, which is about 82 centimeters or something, isn't
Yeah.
it? Now, this has been known. This is not my calculation. This Pythagorean triangle has been known about for some time. I think even Alexander Thom mentioned it, and I think Hawkins as well, one of the astronomers who did the work on Stonehenge, he mentioned it. So this has been known about for some time. But the crucial thing about this Pythagorean triangle is the acute angle, the smaller angle. Is that the acute angle? Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, at the bottom sort of right of this triangle is 22.6 degrees. Now, these Pythagorean triangles are very special triangles. They're the only triangles where all of the sides have whole numbers. And there is only a certain number, a very few of these Pythagorean triangles. And this is the closest Pythagorean triangle you can possibly get to 22.5 degrees. And it's just a confirmation that the size of these circles that we're trying to calculate is about 22.5 degrees. The Pythagorean triangle confirms it. And so now we have a confirmation as it three ways. We have the Stonehenge obliquity just by measuring the size of the yellow circles, the little tiny henges. We have the Pythagorean obliquity at 22.6 degrees, and we have Avebury, if you remember, was 22.5 degrees. They're all sort of pointing at the same sort of angle. And why would they be doing so? I think it's because that the designer knew that the angle of obliquity of the Earth in the era when Stonehenge was made was 22.5 degrees. That was measured, that was known about, and that was actually designed into their design of Stonehenge, which is a fairly technical thing to do. I mean, that's quite a lot of information.
Mm.
And again, we can get a date from that. So this is the same graph that we've seen before of the angle of obliquity of the Earth, stretching back 100,000 years with a sine wave of, four sine waves. And if you remember the angle of obliquity for Avebury and Stonehenge was 22.5 degrees, so we can draw that on here. Here's 22.5 degrees. And here is our date. In fact, here is several dates, because of course this is a sine wave and it stretches back into the past as we've seen before, so we don't have to take the very first of these dates. We can take any of these periods when the angle of obliquity was 22.5 degrees. And so I've just given you four representative dates. We've got, if you look on the top right hand corner, we've got 24,000 years ago, 33,500 years ago, 66,000 years ago, and 74,000 years ago. They're all possibilities. We have no real way of discerning between these different dates. They all end up at 22.5 degrees. And I can't see any way really of separating these dates out just by using Avebury and Stonehenge. And that's a bit of a problem, because if you remember, when we looked at Giza, the date we got from Giza was rather different. It was here on this sort of purple arrow, 13,500 years ago. A completely different date. And yet it would sort of be nice if these megalithic projects were all built at the same time, because they have a lot of similarities, between each other. That's why we call it the megalithic era, because we have all of these megaliths dotted around the world, which all sort of appear to have the same era. And of course, the same era is normally given as, you know, 4,500 years ago or something of that nature, when it could actually be much, much older. So anyway, we don't have a confirmation here with Giza. We have two entirely separate dates. But of course, precession is a recurring event as well. So obliquity has this sine wave, this periodicity of 40,000 years. Precession has a period of 26,000 years. And so in exactly the same manner, you can take precession going backwards as well. Why not? You don't have to take the very first occurrence for Giza. You can use one of the previous ones. And if we do that, then we can draw those on this graph as well. And here they are. So we get one there at 39,000 years ago, one there at 65,500 years ago, and one there at 91,500 years ago. So we do have a connection here between these two megalithic eras, but only if we take the date back to 66,000 years ago. Then we can have a megalithic era when all of these monuments were built at the same time. And that is a long, long time ago. It's much further back in time than I would feel comfortable with. Because, you know, well, we've already looked at Avebury, but could the Giza pyramids have lasted that long? Seems a bit of a stretch, although they were covered originally in very hard Tura limestone, which weathers very, very slowly, is very durable. You can see that from the Bent Pyramid down at Dashur, which is still in good condition today. Okay, it's had some repairs on it, but you know, it's still in good condition even now. So we know these pyramids can easily last for what we know as the traditional megalithic era of 4,500 years ago. It can easily last 4,000 years. So could they last as long as 66,000 years? It's a bit of a stretch, but you know, I suppose it's possible. I don't know any way you could test the durability of Tura limestone to see how long it would last if it wasn't. I mean, the only reason the pyramids are in such poor condition today is because during the Muslim era, they came along and stripped off all the casing blocks. That's why they are in a dilapidated condition. It's not because of weathering. So I don't know. It's much earlier than I would like to have a date 66,000 years ago. And the only fly in the ointment, really, I suppose you might say, is the ice ages. Because, well, Giza doesn't worry because that doesn't have an ice age, but our northern megaliths, Stonehenge and Avebury, were a part of the last ice age, which only ended, call it about 17,000 years ago when the ice sheet started to melt. So if you're pushing this date back 20, even 24,000 years ago, then they would have had to have survived the last ice age. And is that possible? Oh, before we get there, this is just a graphical representation of all of those dates. So on the left, we've got thousands of years before present, going all the way from 0 to 100,000 years ago. Along the bottom, we've got the 4 dates that we've managed to tease out of this. So we've got the Sphinx date, the Giza layout date, Avebury date, and the Stonehenge obliquity date. And so we can drop some markers on here. These are the very most recent dates that we derived. And then the slightly older dates, going back as far as 40,000 years ago. And then the even older dates, and older still dates. And you can see that at the bottom here, if we say that the most recent dates are most likely, then we end up with a difference in the date. So the Avebury and Stonehenge date is about 24,000 years ago, but the Giza and the Sphinx date is about 13,000 years ago. There is like a 10,000 year difference between the two. And so if you like these more recent dates, then you would have to say that there was a 9,000 year lacuna where no work was done, and then the pyramids were constructed at a much later date. Which I suppose you might say is reasonable because the pyramids are a sort of higher technology than the Stonehenge and Avebury, but you still get this 9,000 year gap between the two, which is a little bit unsatisfactory. And if you take it back much earlier, you get the same date. So you do get a megalithic era if you go back 66,000 years ago. But then you have all the problems we've just been looking at in that it's an awful long time ago. And you have to contend with the ice ages. So this is the last ice age. This is the extent of the ice sheets across Scotland and England, which I say sort of started to recede about 17,000 years ago. And they were fully receded by about 12,000 years ago. And then we had the Younger Dryas, which lasted for 1,000 years, and then they receded again and disappeared. So if you're looking at an old date, a very early date for these megaliths, then they would have to have survived the ice sheets. And of course, no megalith could survive being underneath an ice sheet. They move, they're like treacle. I mean, you might think of them as being sheets of rock. I mean, that's how they're sort of displayed in sort of Disney cartoons as great lumps of rock. They're not. They behave like treacle, very, very thick treacle, and they flow over the topography. And if you go down into Antarctica, where they've been flowing, for 1,000,000 years almost, they've got the data there. And they've done a cross section, a radar cross section through the ice. You can see the ice flowing over the top of mountains and then bouncing on the other side, exactly the same as air will do when it flows over a mountain. And it bounces on the other side and causes standing waves, and therefore you get these lenticular clouds that form in the lee of mountains because the air is bouncing up and down. The ice sheets do exactly the same. The layers bounce up and down on the other side of the mountain range, exactly the same as air does. It's it's just much, much thicker, and this takes place much, much slower. So it'll take place over 100,000 years instead of over a space of 5 or 10 minutes. It's treacle, and of course that treacle will take anything with it. So if you've got any monuments out there, the ice will just destroy it and it'll take it with it. So where are Stonehenge and Avebury? They're here. They are clear of the ice. So they could have survived the last ice age. The ice sheets never got that far south. And we know where the ice sheets got to because their evidence is there in the landscape. You have the erratics, which are the boulders that are left over that dropped off the edge of the ice sheets. You've got the big lakes up in Cheshire where lumps of ice, like icebergs, were sitting on the soft ground, and they made these big depressions in the ground. And they are now ponds, of course, lakes. And we've got the scratch marks all over the Pennines and so on, where these big ice sheets scraped their way along the hillsides. So we know exactly where these ice sheets stopped, and they didn't come as far south as Stonehenge and Avebury. But any of the other smaller megaliths in Scotland and Ireland, all of those must be more recent than 11,000 years ago, because they would have been destroyed by the ice. So they must have been built more recently. But of course, they are more recent copies. That's exactly what we did during the cathedral building era in the Middle Ages. Someone comes along and builds a magnificent great cathedral like Salisbury Cathedral with the biggest spire, I think, in the whole of Europe, and it was the biggest spire until like the 19th century, and still standing, by the way. It's, well, I don't know, it's about 700 years old, isn't it? And still standing. And so everyone came to this magnificent cathedral. They saw this cathedral and they went back to their little villages and they wanted to recreate Salisbury Cathedral or whichever cathedral it was in their own little town. And they did. And we call those churches and chapels. So everybody made a copy of the big cathedrals in their little town. And Stonehenge man did exactly the same. They saw Avebury and Stonehenge, and everybody wanted a Stonehenge or an Avebury in their little village. And so they created all of these smaller, more recent henges in all across the country. I don't know how many there are, but there are hundreds of them all over. And that's why we have all of these smaller monuments, but they must be more recent than 11,000 years ago. Otherwise, they'd have been destroyed by the ice sheets. Now, okay, so could someone have built and venerated and visited Stonehenge and Avebury during the Ice Age? What were the weather conditions like? If you wanted to journey up, because I don't think you could live there. I mean, during the winter, it would be pretty inhospitable, I would say, out on the plains of Wiltshire during the peak of the Ice Age. I don't think anyone would want to live there. But you could certainly visit during the summer because it would be nice and warm. And you're probably thinking, well, this was an Ice Age. How can it be warm? Well, actually, the sun itself, when it finally gets on the ground in the summer, was actually warmer during the Ice Age than it is now. And you might think that's a bit strange. That's not, what I've been led to assume, but it's true. And I know this because I've written a whole climate paper on paleoclimates, and this is a part of the paper. So if we look at the energy from the sun over the last 100,000 years, so at the bottom, we've got today's date on the right, 0, up to 100,000 years ago, 150,000 years ago, I suppose, if you take it to the far left. And on the right-hand side, we have the insolation, we call it, at 65 degrees north. By insolation, they mean the amount of sunlight, amount of sun's energy hitting the ground on average during a day, during the summer. And so the amount of energy hitting the ground is the blue line that goes up and down. And it goes up and down because of precession, because precession and obliquity will change the amount of sunlight hitting the ground. And the red line is the temperature. Now, as you can see, the temperature after the last interglacial, which is that red peak on the left-hand side, that's the last interglacial, it cooled, and it steadily cooled all the way down to about 17,000 years ago, when it suddenly warmed again into the present interglacial, which is known as the Holocene. Okay, so that's an ice age. It got colder and colder and colder until it suddenly warmed again. But the blue line is the amount of sunshine, the amount of heat from the sun. And if you follow across from 480 on the right side, you see 480. And can I draw a line across? Yes, I think I can draw a line across there. Let's draw a line at the 480 watts per square meter line. That's the present day amount of heat you'll get from the sun in the higher latitudes. And you can see, if you go back 50,000 years, so if you look at the 50 at the bottom and work your way upwards until you hit the blue line, it was actually warmer 50,000 years ago during the Ice Age than it is now. That was always a conundrum which nobody could explain. And that's why I created my paleoclimate paper, because this conundrum had never been explained in the previous 200 years of scientific endeavor. Nobody explained why with more sunlight you get cooler temperatures. And that's what I explained. And it's all to do with the reflectivity of the ice and the formation of dust, which only happens when CO2 gets very low. So we get this paradoxical situation where low CO2 causes warming and high CO2 causes cooling, which is the complete opposite of what climate scientists are trying to sell us today. They've got it completely arse about face, basically. Wrong way around. Anyway, that's a story for another day. In fact, I think we've talked about this anyway, so I'm sure you can find that in the videos somewhere. But as far as this investigation is concerned, what it means is during the summer, conditions on the plains of Wiltshire might have been quite pleasant. So yes, you could have had your house down in France somewhere, and remember that the English Channel did not exist in this era. It was dry land with a river running down the bottom of it. So you could have had your house in mid-France or the south of France or something, and you could have made your pilgrimage, just as people do today, to Santiago de Compostela or to Mecca or wherever people want to pilgrimage to. Once in your lifetime, you could make the pilgrimage up to the sacred sites of Stonehenge and Avebury. And it wouldn't have taken you that long. People walked an awful long way in those eras. I don't know, you could walk for a month and reach Stonehenge and Avebury. You could stay there a few weeks and then walk back again, all in fairly nice weather conditions. But just don't stay there in the winter, because it would have been pretty bitter during the winter. Because all of this reverses during the winter a little bit. It gets very cold. So yeah, that's the end of this presentation, which I made for the Megalithomania talk down in Glastonbury a few months back. And I think most people were quite interested about it then. So the conclusion is the megalithic era is 13,500 years ago for Giza and 24,000 years ago for Avebury and Stonehenge. Or if you want them combined, you have to go back 66,000 years if you want them to be both combined. And it's your choice. I mean, you take the information, you take the data that's been presented, and you see what seems most reasonable. I would wish that it wasn't 66,000 years ago, because, as I say, I think that is stretching the realms of possibility to go that far back. But I suppose it's possible. There is no external evidence of that apart from the layouts we've been looking at. But then not much has been found on these sites anyway. This is always one of the conundrums of these sites, is they were almost perfectly clean. So there's very little dating material to even carbon-14 date. Any of the material that is just found in the bottom of Avebury, the Avebury ditch, for instance, or some of the burials that have been found in Stonehenge, they're not necessarily coincident with the construction date of these monuments. I mean, for instance, if you're keeping your monument perfectly clean and clearing out the ditch once every century at Avebury, well, you're not going to have any remains in the bottom of the ditch to actually go and date. And so any dating you've done of remains in the bottom of the ditch are from an era when Avebury was abandoned, not from when it was actually constructed. Likewise with the burials at Stonehenge. In ancient days, nobody buried bodies on a temple site because it was a sacred site. You don't bury unclean bodies on your temple. Only Christians do that because they found the nice little urner that you could get lots of money by burying bodies in your church. In ancient days, nobody ever did that. You bury your dead outside the city walls and not in your temples.
mm,
And so if you're finding a burial at Stonehenge, that is from an era when Stonehenge had been abandoned, not from when it was constructed. The only way you could possibly carbon 14 date these monuments is if you lift up one of the stones and find a piece of wood or something underneath it that has been there from when it was constructed. But as I've read from the various reports on these sites, when they did this, because they did lift quite a few of the stones back in the 50s stroke 60s,
mm.
um, the holes were perfectly clean, which is unusual because if you're creating these sites and you're levering these stones into their holes, you're going to use a lot of levers and pit props and God knows what to try and actually get them into the right position. But it looks like someone cleaned out the holes completely and took all of this wooden um, remains away. And so there was nothing to do any carbon 14 dating on, which is all a little bit odd that someone would be so meticulous as to exclude all evidence of organic material from underneath the stones. So there has been no reliable dating of Stonehenge. And of course, when they did this dating of the what they called the totem poles in the car park, in the old car park before it's because it's all changed now. It's the car park has been closed, but in the old car park just to the northwest, I think it was of Stonehenge, um, they discovered I think 4 or 5 of these huge, great tree trunks which were stuck in the ground, and there were remains of wood. So wood will remain in these holes if there was wood there in the first place. So they do carbon 14 dating on these what they called totem poles, and they were dated to, if I remember correctly, about 9,000 years ago. Much older than the date normally given for Stonehenge, and yet we have these big holes right next to the Stonehenge site, which are much older.
So the official dating for Stonehenge is it 2500 BC?
Yeah, I think so. I can't access the internet at present because I've got this thing running. But I
Right.
think if you do a quick Google for
I'm pretty sure
Stonehenge,
it's roughly the same as Avebury, isn't it? It's
I think it is.
2500
Yeah, which is
BC.
about 4,500 years ago.
So what have they based that on?
Not very much. They've based it on the megalithic era, but of course the megalithic era is not based upon much evidence. They've based it on antler uh, finds in Avebury, which were found at the bottom of the Avebury ditch.
Mm,
But as I said, if you're keeping your monument clean, then you're not going to have any antlers stuck at
mm,
the bottom of your ditch.
mm,
So any antler finds are not necessarily coincident with the construction date for Avebury. And it's finds like that that they've used for dating these monuments. And I think it's erroneous.
mm,
Uh, how do you ascertain that any find you've got is coincident with the dating of your monument? You can only do it if it's stratified. And of course, the as far as I've seen from the archaeology that's been done, the remains they're finding are not stratified. So you can't go back through the ages doing dating
mm,
of successive um, artifacts going down through the ages, 2,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago, 8 years ago,
mm,
8,000 years ago. If you get that sort of stratification, you can be fairly sure that your dating is getting fairly accurate because you've got this nice linear dates as you go back in time. But that hasn't been done at Stonehenge and Avebury because they've not found that stratigraphy. One of the problems they found with Stonehenge is rabbits. And these rabbits, of course, have been around there and they've dug holes left, right, and center, and they've scattered materials left, right, and center. So you get the old stuff at the top and the young stuff at the bottom, and it's a complete mess.
mm.
So it's very difficult to get any stratigraphy out of the Stonehenge site. And so there is no reliable carbon-14 dating that I've seen that accurately dates these monuments.
A stone's throw from Avebury, we've got Silbury Hill.
Yes.
We haven't really mentioned that today. So, how does
No.
that play into all this? Are there
Well,
any clues? Go on.
initially I thought it was part of the same layout, but now I'm not so sure because um, Silbury Hill was one of the few places where you can get stratigraphy. So they punched a tunnel through the bottom
Mm,
right to the center of Silbury Hill, and they found original turfs that had been used right at the bottom of Silbury Hill, which still had organic material
mm,
on them. Now that dating, and the problem with this dating, of course, it was done at the very early period of carbon-14 dating, so it was done in the 1960s. But that carbon-14 dating came up with a much later date, of course. It was more coincident with the standard megalithic era. So that was another confirmation to standard archaeology that the megalithic era was only 2,500 odd BC. But of course, we don't know if Silbury Hill is coincident with Stonehenge and Avebury.
mm,
We, apart from the layout in the between these monuments, there is no real connection between them.
mm,
So I don't know. I mean, all I can do is present the information. If anyone likes astrotheology, as it were, or astro history, using the movements of the of the Earth to date something, these are the dates you get. So if you believe that the designer had sufficient knowledge of the movement of the Earth and the form and shape of the Earth, then this is the data they were encoding in the design of their monuments. And of course, we know that ancient man, well, reasonably ancient man, knew the form and shape of the Earth because I've been talking for quite some time about the zodiacs, the Jewish zodiacs, in Judea, where you see Helios, the sun god, holding a blue-green spherical Earth in his gravitational grasp. And let's just drop out of that. So I'm just coming back to you. Yeah. I'll stop screen sharing. Right. So yeah, we have the zodiacs in Judea, which are Nazarene Jewish zodiacs, and they portray Helios holding a blue-green spherical Earth in his gravitational grasp. And that Earth is crossed by two golden lines, two curved golden lines, which are clearly marking out that this is a sphere. It's not a flat disk, it's a sphere. Otherwise, the lines wouldn't be curved. And those lines are either marking the latitudes and longitudes on the Earth, or they're marking the cross of the ecliptic. What they used to do in ancient times is they used to draw a cross between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, and that forms a cross across the sort of equator of the Earth. So they could have been marking that as well because it was quite special in this era. But here's prima facie evidence that the ancients, and this would have been first century, so 2,000 years ago, knew the form and shape of the Earth. And where did they get that information from? Well, it was old data that's come out of, I say, the Neolithic era. I mean, it's not too difficult to do. Eratosthenes, I forget when he was. Anyway, he's probably about 3rd century BC. Measured the size of the Earth using 2 wooden poles. It's not that difficult to do.
mm,
What he did is he had a wooden pole up in the north of Egypt and a wooden pole down in the south. And on a certain date, they measured the shadows on those poles. And from the difference in the shadow lengths, you can calculate the circumference of the Earth. Okay, that's fairly clever thing to know and understand and calculate, but it's very easy to do if you know how to do it.
Mm.
So yeah, I think they had this knowledge way back in the Neolithic era. And I've sort of proved that in my book on Avebury, because we've not talked about it, but those smaller circles in Avebury, they mark latitudes, lines of latitude on that Avebury earth. And they are quite definitely pointing to certain objects on the ground at those particular latitudes. So it seems more than likely that the designer of Avebury understood lines of latitude, could measure them, because you would have to measure them to know at what latitude those monuments were on the face of the earth, and to know that they were there in the first place, because one of them is down in the southern hemisphere.
Mm.
So someone had been down to the southern hemisphere and actually knew that that was there, which is very strange. That that information was encoded in Avebury of a monument. A monument is a set of islands, basically, in the southern hemisphere,
Mm.
and mark it with its exact line of latitude, 58 degrees south. That is more difficult to explain, but it's there. You can see it. It's there.
We've got pyramids all over the world, haven't we?
Yes.
China,
Yes.
the Himalayas, even all over the place. Australia is another one. Was there a global civilization, an advanced global civilization around 10,000 to 30,000 years ago,
Or
or
66,000 years ago.
66,000 years ago? I know, yeah.
um, well, I mean, classical historians will shy away from that, but the evidence is clear that we have, as you say, a megalithic era that spanned the continents. And they were all doing the same sort of things. They were all doing tube drilling. They were doing impossible sort of stone cuts with precise
Mm,
90-degree
mm,
cuts in the stone.
mm.
They were all doing these crazy paving stonemasonry, where all of the stones are completely of different shapes, and yet they're all slotted and fitted together so nicely and exactly.
Some people will try
Um,
and explain that away with geopolymer. That's quite trendy at
yeah,
the moment. That's pretty trendy. A lot
it is quite trendy, but I don't believe it's true, because with the Giza pyramids, for instance, which is the first thing that they said was created with geopolymers,
mm,
uh, we have the quarry where these stones came out of. You can see where they've been cut out of the Tura. That's why it's called Tura limestone. It came from the Tura quarries. You can see where they've cut these stones out of the quarry.
mm,
So we know they're not geopolymer. They were just cut, and they were cut very, very accurately, sometimes on very hard stones, not just limestones. Sometimes they're doing this with granite, which is incredibly difficult to cut into precise shapes. And they were slotting them all together in a very, very high-tech fashion, but then doing it all across the different continents of the world,
mm, mm,
which sort of suggests, if you're broad-minded, and I hang on the edge of this because I don't want to be so broad-minded that my brain falls out, as they like to say, but nevertheless, you've got all of these monuments that are pretty much the same across the entire world,
mm,
and they're identical. And you might suggest from that we had a global culture at the same time, the megalithic era, that were all doing the same thing. Or, because the problem with that theory is we have no evidence of this global culture. If we had a culture as advanced as we are now, and as populous as we are now, with as much infrastructure as we have now, you would have a layer of technology in the archaeological record.
mm,
So you would dig down 10 meters and you would come across all of this stuff: reinforced concrete, railway lines, all of the stuff that's going to last for a number of thousand years. You would have a great layer of technical infrastructure,
mm.
and it doesn't exist.
Well,
So,
as far as we know, I hate to be conspiracy theorist here, but perhaps that the people that control the narrative have archaeologists that work for them and have dug all this out without our knowledge. I know there's a guy, the guy that's friends with Hugh Newman that lives really close to the pyramids in Cairo. I'm trying to remember his name, but he says that you see things, excavations going on in Cairo regularly, and it's never reported, it's never talked about. These things go on. So is that a possibility? I
Yeah,
don't know.
I suppose that's possible. I think it's difficult to cover up. I mean, I was there in Zagazig in Egypt when they uncovered Makara Mutamhat. She was the daughter of Susens II. And anyway, this massive statue was discovered of this lady who was an incarnation of Isis, as they all were, bare-breasted as usual. But her statue, it was just the upper half of her body. Her face was like 2 meters tall. I mean, this was big. And that was just coming out of the ground while I was there, while I was staying there. So I sat and watched them while they were doing it. So, I mean, it's not beyond the realms of possibility of people to sit there. And of course, you've got a multinational, because Egypt normally likes to do this in cooperation with various universities because they get money that way. And so this was being funded by a French university with French archaeologists. And so you've got a broad spectrum of people who are on site doing this dig. It's not just, local sort of government controlled people. And there was me. I'd paid my 10 shekels or whatever it was. No, they don't have shekels over there, do they? They have pounds, I think, to get into the site. And I sat and watched them as they uncovered this huge, great statue. Wow. The other possibility is something that archaeologists again don't want to mention, is the possibility of the 2001 scenario, the ancient astronaut scenario. That the reason why you cannot find a technical layer within the archaeology is because there was only a very small number of people who had this knowledge. And when they had finished the building, they disappeared again. And of course, they will ridicule this idea and say it's tinfoil hat and it's conspiracy and there's no evidence. But if you ask any scientist, if you ask any astronomer, is there life in the universe? 99.9% of astronomers will say yes. There has to be. There are just far too many suns out there with planets in the same sort of orbit as ours, what they call the Goldilocks zone, where you can get life. There's just far too many of them for us to be the only species. So the only question is, has an alternative species ever visited the Earth?
Sorry, Ralph, did they have elongated skulls?
Well, yeah, I've said this before because, yes, that's what Akhenaten was trying to display when he had himself depicted in the form and shape of the gods as he understood them. And what Akhenaten depicted himself as was, as you say, with elongated head, almond-shaped eyes, with a triangular sort of head, wide hips, a sort of amorphous sort of body, not hermaphrodite, androgynous sort of body, that was Akhenaten. And of course, they used that form and shape, that symbolism, when they designed the Hollywood Grey. And that was done on purpose. The Hollywood Grey is Akhenaten. That's what they based it upon. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what did Akhenaten know about this, and why did he want himself portrayed in that fashion? Well, we know he didn't look like that because there are statues of Akhenaten where he's perfectly normal. So quite obviously, this was a fashion. This was a symbolism that he wanted to portray. And remember, no artist is going to do this without the permission of the pharaoh. you would end your life pretty quickly if you went against what the Pharaoh wanted.
Mm.
So this was actually dictated by Pharaoh himself. Akhenaten said, portray me like this,
Mm.
because I want to look like this. I want to look very strange with this strange head and strange body, and no genitalia, which is another thing. Just like the galley of
Mm.
the galley of Galilee in Judea, the galley priests who were all eunuchs, so they had had the same sort of operation. And yes, they were all galley eunuchs, and they venerated the primeval Adam. And of course, nobody knows who the primeval Adam is. He's a sort of like a demigod, or maybe a demiurge, I think they call it.
Mhm.
A demiurge being a sort of construction god, a god who actually creates things, a creator god, as opposed to the high god. But anyway, they venerated the primeval Adam. And the primeval Adam sounds awfully like Akhenaten.
Mm.
Again, he was androgynous, he was a sexless being.
Mm.
And I think they were venerating. So this was the Jews, the Nazarene Jews of the first century. And it was specifically said that these were the people who venerated the primeval Adam. And I think they were venerating imagery of Akhenaten
Mm.
because they were related to the pharaonic line,
Mm.
and they knew about it. So anyway, yeah, that's sort of a little bit off topic, but the question is, why did Akhenaten want to look like this? And of course, the primary possibility, I think, is that he wanted to look like the gods,
Mm.
as he understood what the gods looked like.
Mm.
Whether he was correct or not is entirely another thing. I mean,
Mm.
we've got no idea what information he was basing that particular
Mm.
physiology upon. But that is a scenario which would explain the megalithic era, because the megalithic era is not explainable very easily in terms of ancient Neolithic man.
Mm.
Some of these stones are far too large. We're talking over in Baalbek at stones 1,400 tons, which are very, very difficult to move. Bordering on totally impossible and utterly impractical. There's no way you would want to do that if you had a simpler method of doing it, like chopping all of the blocks up into smaller blocks and just cementing them together.
So have you ever theorized as to how these structures were built?
Well, if you have outside interference, then of course they can easily be built because they had outside technology.
Okay.
But they would only be there as an instructional period for say a century or so, depending on how long-lived those beings would be.
Mm.
I mean, this is the fallacy with the UFO phenomena that we have nowadays, that they're still promoting this in government circles. They are still promoting, even in recent months, that we have UFOs that have been detected by F-18s running around in the US Air Force and so on, when clearly they are not. They are when you're programming a radar, you use these things in order to program the radar. So you have false identifications which you can use to calibrate your radar. And it's quite obvious that these dots are actually part of the calibration process that have been left into the program and shouldn't have been there. And so these pilots are seeing this thing running across their radar when it's just an artifact of the software, basically.
Mm.
But nevertheless, it's being promoted as proper UFOs by the government. They're promoting it. And then you have things like crop circles and so on. And again, you're not going to fly across, 150 light years of space to draw a few silly patterns in a cornfield. That's not going to be the sort of
Well,
visitation that you're going to get.
if they're designed and made by humans, there must be the modern day version of Leonardo da Vinci knocking about in Wiltshire, because
Oh yes.
some of the
Oh, they're
designs
very
are incredible. You know.
Yeah, they're very complicated. But
Mm.
one of the groups who used to make these made a was it BBC or was it Channel 4? Made a Channel 4 program on how they made them. And yes, it's fairly sophisticated surveying techniques, but nothing out of the ordinary. It was all done with ropes and GPS and whatever.
I do remember seeing a video once with regards to crop circles, and this was on television, and there were these two or three little orbs that were flying about above the ground, and you actually saw the circles forming, the patterns forming with these little orbs above. Now, I just want to share with you something quickly. I had a very strange experience once in Avebury, or coming back from Avebury, driving from Avebury to Marlborough, where I was staying in a hotel. I think this was the first time I went to Avebury. I was just driving with my wife down the road, and all of a sudden the car started shaking quite violently. So, I was quite alarmed. And then I worked out, I saw that there was an Apache helicopter. It couldn't have been more than I don't know, it felt like 100 feet above the car. My car was literally shaking. And then it suddenly flew off to the right. And I looked up, and this is what I saw, and this is what my wife saw. We saw a large orangey yellow orb, and it appeared to be trying to attach itself to the helicopter. It was right by it. The helicopter was trying to shake it off and move about. It then darted off over a field. At this point, I parked the car up and jumped out, much to the amusement of my wife, and ran into this field and saw, the last thing I saw was the yellow orb shoot right down to the ground, and the helicopter flew away, and that was it. So this was my personal experience. I mean, how can that possibly be explained, in a
It sounds like an helicopter firing off a flare, a defensive flare or something of that nature. I mean, these things happen all the time. And if you've got a computer controlled car, it won't happen on an old fashioned car. But if you've got a computer controlled car,
this was about 12
you,
years ago,
you
yeah.
yeah, the attack radar from a helicopter can interfere with your electronics. They are very, very powerful radars that they use. They're nothing like the ones used in commercial
Mm,
aircraft. So it's possible that the radar could interfere with your electronics.
mm, mm.
Um, I mean, this was one of the scenarios that they were promoting initially when the 777 dropped out of the sky at Heathrow. If you remember the British Airways 777 that fell onto the ground and missed the runway. One of the scenarios was that Gordon Brown was underneath it because he was in a motorcade going on the perimeter road. And of course, they use fairly sophisticated electronics for radar jamming and so on, and for jamming bombs in the roads and all this sort of stuff. As it happens, that was nothing to do with it. It was ice in the intercoolers for the fuel. It was a fuel oil intercooler, had ice formation on it, and it was a combination of the flight they had done, which was very unusual and very cold. So the fuel was super cooled. You're not allowed to let your fuel go below 45 degrees centigrade. Minus 45 is the coldest you're allowed to allow your fuel to get. Otherwise, it starts waxing. So it was very cold fuel, and there was a design flaw on the heat exchanger, which nobody had thought about. And this is the trouble sometimes with design engineering. It looks good. You've got no reason to doubt the design. You put it through all the tests that it's supposed to go through, and it works fine, because you've never tested that one particular scenario where it's not going to work. And suddenly they hit that one particular scenario where they had done a throttles closed descent all the way from altitude all the way down to the last sort of 1,500 foot. And ice had built up on the heat exchanger because the tubes from the heat exchanger poked out for no good reason. It's only for ease of manufacture, for no other good reason. The tubes poked out by about a centimeter. And that was enough to allow them to be cool and for the fuel to condense and freeze on it,
Yeah.
because fuel, petrol and aerofuel and so on always contains water. It's always a real problem with aviation that you've got to try and get rid of pretty much all of the water within the fuel, but there's always water in the fuel, and it condensed out and froze, and it formed an ice barrier on the fuel feed lines.
Mm.
And so the engines ran out of fuel and it collapsed. Anyway, that's a total by the by. It just shows how complex these things are.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, events like this happen all the time, and you've got to try and differentiate between what's possible and what's likely. Again, if you've got a civilization that's come across 150 light years to get here, they're not going to play around with helicopters. So you really have to look for another scenario for that. And there are things that the military do which are very confusing. I mean, for instance, once I came back from France and we were flying descending, so we were probably coming down through 20,000 foot or so, and there was this two bunches of grapes hanging in the sky. This was night, of course. So these two enormous bunches of grapes were hanging in the sky and just not moving, just sitting there at about 15,000 foot or so. And what was it? I mean, it looks totally very, very strange. But it was over the Black Mountains in Wales, next door to Hereford. So that might give you a clue. It was the SAS. And of course, what they do is they fire up these parachute flares to illuminate the ground. So if they want to know what's going on at night, they have these enormous great flares that go up on parachutes, and they take half an hour to come down. I mean, it's a long, long time that they just sit in the sky, and they are really bright. They're like searchlights, and they'll fire up about 10 of them, so you've got the whole place illuminated. Looks very strange, but it's just the SAS playing around. These things happen all the time, and we see these odd events all the time, but the vast majority are explicable, easily explicable.
I've heard the Salisbury Plain being described as the Area 51 of
Yes,
of England,
it is.
basically.
Yeah.
But why? Why is that? Why are the military
Oh, because it's the big army ground. Um, for people in America or anyone else who doesn't know, Salisbury Plain, where Stonehenge and Avebury are, is the army training ground. It's the biggest army training ground we've got in the whole of England. And it's a huge site where they will actually fire long range rockets and howitzers and so on, and tanks charge across it left, right, and center. You've got drones up there. You've got the RAF plays over the top because they're trying to pick out the tanks and so on and prove that they can knock out the tank. Everything is happening over Salisbury Plain. And so you get a lot of strange activity in that area, a lot of strange radar activity and all sorts of things, searchlights and flares and you name it, it's going off over there. So yeah, I'm not surprised you get lots of funny sightings across there. But as I say, no one is going to come across 150 light years and play silly buggers with F-18s. You would know about it. It would be, a huge event that you would not be able to disguise. And we have sort of no idea of how this could ever occur, because if you're coming across 150 light years of space, how long is that going to take you? If we conform to standard physics where you can't go faster than light, that's a hell of a journey.
Don't they travel through wormholes?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's completely speculative. It would be nice to think that they could, but under standard physics, they're limited to the speed of light, and it's going to take you an awful long time to get anywhere. And so you're not going to visit it very often. And therefore, if you go somewhere and you create a monument, it's going to have to last several thousand years, because you're not going to be able to get back again for several thousand years. And therefore, you're going to need a megalith, preferably made of something like granite. So it's going to last a long time, which is exactly what we find. And of course, why would you want to build it? And why not write your name on it? Well, the reason for building it would be, we could speculate because we have no evidence for this. The reason for building it is that it's a work project that will create a civilization. Now, generally, when we go around and we find, tribes in the outer Amazon somewhere, we have a non-interference policy that we don't interfere with their development and their culture. This would be a sort of modified non-interference policy. So if they had been monitoring us, they might have realized that ape man and sort of very basic human existence hadn't changed for a million years. So since we were progressing so bloody slowly, they might have thought, well, let's give them a nudge up.
Mm.
A bit like
Yeah,
2001: A Space Odyssey.
yeah.
If anyone has watched that, it's the formative film of the 1970s. Well, 1960s, because it actually was made before man had actually stepped on the moon.
The year before, I think.
Yeah, the year before. And that was tricky because they didn't really know what was going to be found. And so they were making this film without actually having any knowledge or pictures of the surface of the moon, apart from what you can take with telescopes. And so they had to create the moon surface in their film by guesstimate. And by golly, I think they got it right.
Mm.
Their moon surface images are absolutely spot on.
Mm.
Um, and so, yeah, the thrust of the film is that beings come along. You never see the beings, of course.
Mm.
Beings come along and they teach um, ancient man. I mean, they go back to sort of ape man,
Yeah.
basically, and they teach ape man how to be, well, not how to be civilized, but how to survive, how to kill,
Mm.
because they were vegetarians and starving, as vegetarians often do, and they needed a bit of meat in their diet. And so that's what they were taught how to do, how to hunt. And in the space of I don't know, about 20 seconds of film time, they jump from a million years BC to the current era, to 2001,
Mm.
with spacecraft flying across. And that was a very formative film because it was forward looking. And so if you were a student, as I was when this came out, I watched the moon landings at school because I was still at school, in junior school. Uh, that had a deep effect on your thinking,
Mm.
that we are pushing forward. Anything is possible. Today we've got aircraft. Tomorrow we're going to have bases on the moon. We're moving forward. This is civilization. We're pushing forward.
What went wrong
And
afterwards then? Because we've not
yeah,
really been back,
ab-
have we? And I read
absolutely.
something recently that NASA have said that they basically lost the technology to get us there and
Mm,
back. I mean,
yeah.
that seems a little bit. I'm a little bit dubious about that.
Oh no, because the technology changed. This was the whole problem. Suddenly it was electronic, and you had to reformulate all of the technology into the modern era. When I started in aviation, we had mechanical VORs and ILSs. Um, VORs and ILSs are the navigation instruments that aircraft use. Even today, they will use a VOR and ILS for navigation and landing, and for doing all the blind landings and everything like that is done on an ILS. We had mechanical ones with gears in it. It was all electromechanical, and you could hear all these gears whirring around behind you. And the unit it came in was a standard electronic box, but it was like a meter long, and it weighed like, oh, I don't know, 15 kilos. I mean, it was just full of gears, and it worked. But of course, we don't use that now, so it all had to be reinvented. The 737, a Boeing 737, a modern airliner, it has a computer. The FMC, they call it, the flight management computer. And it's the same size as an iPad. So that sort of size, but with only a thousandth of the computing power as an iPad. But when you want to take it out for servicing, it's got a big handle on it, and you pull it out, and it's nearly 1 meter long, and it has 1,000th of the capabilities of an iPad. And that's what they are still using in
Wow.
737s to this day, because it's very difficult to change it. Because if you change it to something modern, you've got to recertify it, and nobody wants to do that. And the 737 computer was based on the 286 processor. You remember those?
No.
From the came from the Sinclair Spectrum.
Oh, I remember those. Yeah, sure. Wow.
That's the sort of computing power it was using. And of course, they can't change it. So they're still using 286 processors.
Yeah.
And I never did find out what they're doing with these. I did ask the engineers about this, and they didn't know either. Whether they had a hangar full of 286 processors they'd bought before they went out of production, or whether they're using a 286 emulator that's a new chip that runs the same way as the old 286. But that's what they're using in their computers, because it's very difficult to update these old-fashioned things. So all of the technology they were using in the Apollo era is not applicable today. If you go across to the Kennedy Space Center and have a look at their computers that they were using iron core processors. And these were the things, because I started in computing. I was a computer analyst, and we had the mainframe for a major company in Britain, a very, very large company. And the big mainframe, which was in a room bigger than most houses, about 4 times the size of a normal house. In that room, we had a computer which was an iron core IBM computer. It had a memory of 2 gigabytes, I think. Was it gigabytes or megabytes? It must have been gigabytes, surely. Anyway,
I think.
it was very, very small. And all of the computing was done on that computer. And if people don't know what iron core computers are, they are physically strung wires with iron rings on them. So someone has to actually string out a copper wire and then put little iron rings all the way along the wire. And these wires go, left, right, right, left, and horizontal. And from those, you can see the magnetism of these particular iron rings. And each iron ring is a bit. So you can imagine how many of these iron rings you've got to thread up with copper wire before you can get a computer to actually work. I think it was megabytes. I don't think it was gigabytes. I think it was 2.5 megabytes. It was very, very small in modern terms. And that's what they were using for the Apollo program. So if you look at their computers, they were they had these iron core computers and some of the very early transistor computers. And it's hardware and software that is just not usable today. And so all of that has to be reinvented in modern integrated circuit terms. So it's like going back and reinventing the wheel all over again, because, as you were saying, they've forgotten how to do it, and they had to reinvent it.
Still,
So
they've had over 50 years now, haven't they? It's a long time.
yeah, but they put no money into it. This was the problem. We had this backwards looking generation, even before the woke generation. I mean, they're just the worst of the worst. But we had these backwards looking generations who would not put money into space research and space science. Suddenly it was all introspective, looking at yourself within society. Oh, isn't society so poor? We must do something about people in society. Yeah, but if you expand the civilization, you drag people along with the civilization. That's the whole process. That's how civilization has improved over the last 2,000 years. It's not because you sit and look after every individual within society. It's because we've progressed and we've had the technical revolution, the industrial revolution, and that's pulled people out of poverty. Which is a much better way of pulling people out of poverty than dealing with the individual on an individual basis.
Mm.
Thatcher, oh, this will be a terrible thing to say because she's such a divisive character. Dear old Margaret Thatcher had the same basis. She said, look, don't divide up the cake differently, make the cake bigger. And then we'll all be richer because the cake is bigger.
Mm.
And I think there's a lot of truth in that. You want to
Mm.
increase the economy to make everybody richer.
Mm.
And that way you'll drag people out of poverty.
Mm.
And at last, we've got a little bit of space research going on again. So we've now got Elon Musk, who
Yeah, this
I know
is.
you're not.
Well, I've never said I'm not fond of him. I think it maybe it's my working class roots. I just have an inbuilt distrust of someone with that much wealth. I just
Yes.
think, why do you need that much money? But anyway, carry on.
Well, in this case, I think he's done very well with it because he's plowed most of that money back into research, and he has nothing for himself. I mean, he sold all of his houses. He doesn't have a house anymore. Literally because this has become his life, is creating these new industries. And within the space industry, it's remarkable what you can do if you have a different person in charge. So, for instance, he has done more than NASA ever did in 50 years. He's done the same in 10 years and done things that NASA said was impossible. So things like re-landing his rockets, so you don't have to destroy a rocket every time he re-lands them back. And the top one now has flown 15 times. I mean, as he said, if you get onto an aircraft and you fly from LA to New York, you don't scrap the aircraft when you get there. You use it again. And so he has these reusable rockets, which has reduced the price of getting to orbit by an enormous amount. But another interesting comparison is he started his company at the same time as Bezos, the Amazon man, started his rocket company. Bezos has done nothing.
I wasn't even aware
And
he had a rocket company.
well,
No, I
precisely.
didn't know that at all.
He's been putting billions of dollars into his rocket company over the same time span as Elon Musk. In fact, he started before Elon Musk. And all he's managed to do is put it's not even a rocket, you could say. It only goes up to 100 kilometers and comes straight back down again. It's nothing. It's a firecracker. So all he's produced in the last, I mean, this has got to be something like 14 years. All he's produced is a firecracker. Meanwhile, Elon Musk is launching more rockets now than any nation, in fact, all other nations put together. So all of America, all of China, all of Europe, all of those nations put together, and Russia, of course, he's launching more rockets than all of them put together. So more than half of the rockets going up are Elon Musk rockets. And he just lands them back again and fires them back up again. And I think the quickest return to service was in something like 2 weeks. Came back, landed, refurbished, send it back up again. I mean, it's the way to go, obviously. So, and the only difference between those two companies is the CEO, the leader of that company. And from that different leadership, you can get an entirely different result. So, and that's key in a way, because if you can do that with a company, you can do that with a nation as well, and you can do that with a civilization. It really depends on who is in charge, and that's why it's so important to get the right people in charge.
Well, perhaps governments are becoming obsolete very gradually. Who knows?
Well, yes. Well, the trouble is you need someone in charge, and you need some way of deciding who it is. And it's so difficult to get the right mechanism to choose who is going to be. I mean, because the Romans had a lousy system because it was so dependent on who was in charge, and you could not get rid of them. The only way you could get rid of them is by knocking them off, basically, and which is why so so many of them came to a sticky end. They didn't have a decent way of re-electing a new leader.
mm,
And of course, in the modern era, we've tried to overcome that with democracy. It's not perfect, but it's better than the Roman system. It's better than the Russian system, you know, or the Chinese system. Come to that again. Once you get these people in power in Russia and China, you can't get rid of them,
mm,
which is fine if you've got a great leader. If you've got Vespasian in charge, everything's fine. If you can get Vespasian there for 50 years, brilliant. But of course, he died within 10 years. And so then his sons were not half as good as he was. And it all started degenerating again.
mm,
And it wasn't until you came up until the next emperors, which were again a couple of good emperors at the end of the first century. This problem of getting the right leaders into government is very tricky. And I think we mentioned this before when we were discussing wokeism. The problem with the current system is you don't get intelligent people into government. You normally get the egotists and
mm,
the dramatists. I mean, you've only got to look at Trudeau. The
mm.
guy doesn't have a brain cell to
No,
rub together.
no, they're just yes men, aren't they? That's all
Yeah,
they are.
totally,
Yeah.
totally.
Mm,
There should be an examination. There was an examination when I started my career, both of my careers in computing and aviation. You had to pass an examination. You had to go to college and go through a course the same as any other. You know, if you want to become a doctor or whatever you want to become, you have a course and you must pass an examination. And then for the most important job in the whole of the country, there is no course, there is no education, and there is no examination. That has got to change. We can't have these dullards
mm,
getting into positions of power because they know nothing.
mm,
And then they're dependent on these government advisors who can tell them anything because they've got no way of sorting out what's true and what's false
mm.
because they're idiots. You know, I don't know what Boris got, but I think it was a couple of O levels and that was about it. You know,
Probably. Yeah.
oh, it's hopeless. Um, and a lot of the other of them were no better.
Mm.
Cameron was no better. Um, May, I'm sorry for people who are not British and they don't understand all of our prime ministers we've had, but Cameron was came from the best of schools, the
He went
same as Boris.
he
They
went to
came from
Marlborough,
Eton.
didn't he? Oh, I thought he
No,
went
he
to
went to
Marlborough,
Eton.
Cameron. Okay.
No, I think he was in the same. You might be right. They were in the same group in Oxford, not
Mm,
necessarily at the same school. Yes, you might be
mm,
right on that. Um, but anyway, they were at the same college in Oxford. They were all together,
mm.
but none of them were particularly bright.
No.
Um, Miss May was slightly brighter, but she wasn't commanding. And if you've got to be in that position, you've got to be commanding because you've got to tell people what to do. And she was just like a wet lettuce. She was just bloody hopeless.
Mm,
Um, she went to Europe and said, "We want to leave Europe," and they said, "Right, you owe us 40 billion, um, 40 billion pounds in order to leave." And she said, "Oh, okay.
mm,
Oh, well, thank you, Miss May." Just
mm.
stupid idiot.
Well, I have to wonder
Um,
sometimes, Ralph, how much of it is actually genuine, and how much of it is just opium for the masses. It's just there to pantomime. You know, as you're saying, our leaders come across as becoming more and more, stupid, really,
yeah,
clown-like, if
they
you
are.
like Boris, and it's hard to believe that someone like that is running the country. So
Yeah.
I mean, maybe these people are just put into position to perform a role, but they're not actually leading the country as
Yes,
such.
yes, and no, because of the example of Thatcher. Love her or hate her, she was in command,
Mm,
and she gave the direction to the government. It was pretty obvious that she was in charge, whether you think she was doing good or doing bad. So it is possible to take the reins of government, the levers of power, and play with them a bit. She demonstrated that. And there've been presidents in the US who have done likewise, but likewise, there have been insipid presidents who have done nothing. If you, I can't remember all of their names now, but they've had some pretty bad ones. I
Yeah.
mean, the peanut farmer was pretty insipid, wasn't he? What was his name again? I forget what his name was.
Clinton, Bush, Obama.
No, before them.
Oh, Jimmy Carter.
Before them.
Carter.
Yes, Carter, the peanut farmer.
Mm.
Um,
And Ronald Reagan was an actor, of course, as well, wasn't he?
yes, but he was decisive. And he did change the direction of the nation. And everyone took the mickey out of him because, of course, Hollywood loves to take the mickey out of anyone who's Republican. But I was watching some of his old speeches the other day, and they were actually very funny and very incisive.
Mm.
I thought they were really, really good speeches. This is before he went gaga, because at
Yeah.
the end of his career, of course, he
Mm.
got Alzheimer's and he
Mm.
went very gaga. But
Mm.
when he was actually in president before that, yeah, he was a great leader at that time. But
Wasn't he was there was an attempted assassination on Reagan at some point, and
yes,
I'm sure I've read somewhere that the assassin that was arrested, or the attempted assassin, whatever, the previous night he'd been having dinner with the Bushes.
oh, Eddie, oh, I didn't read that one.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
he was shot, and he actually got
mm,
shot. He had a bullet went out into his spine, which had to be taken out.
yeah,
Luckily, it was a very low-powered pistol, so he
mm,
didn't do too much damage.
yeah,
But I mean, it didn't kill, but one of the bodyguards was in a vegetative state ever after, sort of thing.
mm,
Who got himself in the way, which is their job, of course.
mm,
So yeah, that was a
mm,
very tricky situation.
mm,
That's America. Again, they're running on the Roman system.
mm,
Although that's not the only way for getting rid of presidents, of course, but
mm,
they still seem to shoot quite a
mm,
lot of them.
yeah, definitely. Is this Ralph? Is this dating the megaliths? What's happened?
Yeah, I don't know. We've sort of wandered off track, haven't we? Well, we wandered off track because we don't know why the megaliths were built. So we've derived a date for the megaliths, and the date doesn't suit the archaeology very well in terms of the knowledge and scope and scale of the megaliths and the civilization that was available at that time.
Mm,
There is a complete mismatch. Even if you want to take it as 4,500 years ago, there is still a mismatch
mm,
between the technology available and the technology we see within these megaliths. You've got the same problem, whether you want it 4,500 years ago or 66,000 years ago.
mm, mm,
You've still got the same problem, that they are anomalous. They shouldn't really be there at
mm.
that size, scale, and the technology and information that they encode. And how do you explain that? Well, that's what we've been trying to explore. Do you go for a lost civilization that you've lost all of the telltale signs that a civilization would
So
leave behind?
that would be Atlantis, and people that support that theory talk about the cataclysm that occurred around about 12,000 years ago.
What, the Younger Dryas?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes, but the Younger Dryas, I mean, I'm a subscriber to the Younger Dryas impact theory. So we had this cold period. If people don't know the Younger Dryas, we had a cold period about 12,500 years ago. It lasted for about 1,000 years. Just as the world was warming, so we were coming into the interglacial, and suddenly it went cold again. And people have postulated that a meteor or a comet came in and caused some destruction. And there is some evidence for that, and I've written several articles on this.
There are. I'm trying to think of the exact ones, but I know there are huge statues and some structures in Egypt that have been there since ancient times that appear to have scorch marks on a side of them. Brian Forster has highlighted this in his videos.
Yes, I saw that. I wasn't entirely convinced that they were caused by heat, but I don't know. I'll have to
Mm,
see those. um, in the flesh, because I'm not familiar with those particular stones. But the thing that is possibly connected with it are the Carolina Bays. So across eastern and central North America, there are a whole series of impact craters. 500,000 of them. I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands of these craters. And of course, in classical geology, they are called aeolian ponds.
Yeah, this is
So,
what this is what Ignatius Donnelly wrote about, if I remember rightly, many,
oh,
many
did he?
decades. I think so, yeah. He wrote a book,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's an old theory that goes, well, it only goes back to about the 1920s, I think.
Mm,
This particular theory that it was caused by a comet. I've added my own slight deviation to the standard theory. So the standard theory is that there was a comet that came in that broke up, and therefore you had these multiple impacts.
mhm.
And then it was discovered by West and Firestone. That's a good name for a man investigating meteors, isn't it? Honestly, that's his name. His name is called Firestone. But anyway, they came up with this evidence that all of these Carolina bays, which look like impact craters, they look like sort of egg-shaped, oval, very small, very shallow impact craters, that they're all pointing to the same location. They're all pointing towards the Great Lakes. And that's odd, because if these were wind-formed ponds, which they say, aeolian ponds formed by the winds, it's there are no other examples of these ponds anywhere else in the world, because they're so regular. They're not misshapen whatsoever. They're perfectly regular. And B, they all point in the same to the same origin, no matter where they are, because they occur all the way from sort of New York State all the way down to Florida, almost all the way down to South Carolina.
Mm,
And they all point. So they have to point in different directions, of course, to all point at the same place. They all point at the same place. Very difficult to get winds to do that. Whereas if you had an impact that struck the Laurentide ice sheet, because the Laurentide ice sheet would have still been there to some degree at that time, it could have sprayed debris all over North America.
mm,
And of course, that would have a central locus, a central point from which it originates, and a radiant, you might call it. And so again, all of these secondary impact craters would all point at the same location.
mm.
Now, that was backed up, and I think the best research has been done by Michael DeVias. And if you want to look it up, because you won't find it, I think it's been shadow banned because it won't come up in a search. Look for the Cintos website by Michael DeVias. So it's CINTOS, the Cintos site. And he's done an investigation into the Carolina Bays, and he found Carolina Bays in Nebraska and Kansas. So right out in central North America.
Mm,
And lo and behold, they all point at the Great Lakes again.
mm,
Now, that is very, very difficult to get in sort of a wind-formed fashion. You've got to have these winds all managing to make these Carolina Bays all line up, pointing at the same location. Whereas again, if this was an impact onto an ice sheet just over the Great Lakes somewhere, again, they would all point, all the secondary impacts would point to the same location.
mm.
And this has only come about recently because of LiDAR mapping, you might say. So LiDAR is mapping via lasers, and it gives you precise altitudes or heights of the land. Because these Carolina Bays are very, very shallow, almost impossible to see them in the environment, apart from the different trees that grow around them, which betray where they are. But the LiDAR picks them out very well, and that's why these these Carolina bays were found in central North America.
Mm.
And he's done a lot of research on them and looked at them, and I think pretty much most of that is correct. The only thing I think he's got wrong is he's looking at a date 800,000 years ago,
Ooh.
because classical geology has said that through thermoluminescent dating of grains of sand in the bays, that they have to be much older. And so he's had to push the date back to 800,000 years. I don't think that's possible, because these are only ponds with small rims, only about 2 meters high. They're not very deep, made of sand. I don't think they could possibly last 800,000
Mm.
years. I mean, that's an awful long time for a very shallow bay to manage to stay in the environment. I think what's happened is that these thermoluminescent datings are incorrect, because it works well if you have stratified material, because it works on exposure of these grains of sand to sunlight, which resets their dates. But if they weren't laid down by the winds, if they weren't stratified, if they were actually caused by an impact which was just overturning some of this material, then the thermoluminescent dates would be wrong. You would be dating the original material, not when it was laid down as a new impact crater.
Mm.
And so I think that dating is wrong. And I think it was to do with the Younger Dryas and the Younger Dryas impact theory, because at that time, at that very, very time, we have the black mats across the whole of North of America, which is a thick black layer in the strata, which was formed by damp, dank conditions. It's sort of like moss and ferns and so on has made this black line in the strata. And below that strata, you get the megafauna and you get Clovis man. Megafauna being any of the large fauna above 50 kilos, I think they normally say. Above that black line, there is no megafauna, there is no Clovis man. There was a complete reset of the animal life across the whole of North America. Now, that's not going to happen just with, a change in the climate, but it would happen if you had a massive, a million impacts from secondary impacts splashing down across North America,
Mm.
because it would be utterly devastating.
Mm.
And so, yes, you would lose the megafauna, you would lose Clovis man. And one of the archaeologists or paleontologists, Vance Haynes, very, very well-known professor, and he says that the gap between the megafauna and the strata missing the megafauna is instantaneous, less than 100 years.
Mm.
Now, that's not geological. Things don't happen that quickly in the geological record. If you're wiping out all of the megafauna in 100 years, that's got to be something like a meteor impact. And that's one of the reasons why I think the impact theory is probably correct. But the way I've modified it is, Michael Devias was saying that the impacts laid down these sand layers. I don't think that's possible. There's too much material for that to be possible. There was another chap said that the ice from the Laurentide ice sheet made holes in the ground which were filled in to form these elliptical bays. That is disproven by the by geology, which does not indicate any holes underneath these bays. They are just very shallow bays. So I suggested that when the meteor hit the Laurentide ice sheet, it broke the ice into slush balls. Because if you shock ice, it's not very strong, it will shatter. And so the ice coming out of the Laurentide ice sheet in these, you can imagine just like splashing a drop of water into water and get this little droplets of water come off it, all rushing across North America at hyper velocities, probably Mach 10, Mach 12. They would be made of shattered ice, like slush balls, like snowballs. And so when they finally touched down, when they finally hit the ground, they didn't make big craters because they were soft. And so they splashed into the environment and caused these elliptical bays, which is quite possible because experimentation has been done to show that you can make elliptical bays if you have a soft enough object to make the bay. So yeah, that's an interesting part of the history of this era. Not sure how we got onto that topic.
No.
Yeah, well, where did that come
I'm
from? Not
glad
sure.
we did, because it was fascinating, and everything's been fascinating today. There are many, many questions, spin-off questions that have come up, but unfortunately, we're nearly 2.5 hours in now, Ralph. So
Yes,
I think
I think you've got 3 episodes there. I
yeah,
think.
yeah. Well, possibly. We'll see what happens. But yeah, it's been brilliant. The presentation was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. I'm sure I'll be watching it back many, many times. But I think we'll end it there. So please like, share, and subscribe, everyone. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll be back very soon. Cheers.
Thanks for having me again. Thank you.
Ralph.